Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of January 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kiev, because today we got more details and more updates about the consequences of the Russian strikes in this area. If you remember, during the previous few days the Russians were bombing and attacking all of the entire Ukraine. The strikes took place in explosions in Odessa, Kharkiv, in the western part of Ukraine and Lvov, and of course especially in Kiev. And today we got more details and more updates. For example, on this scene we can see one building, and the footage from the satellite we see a black hole inside of this area. So that was a very big powerful plant that Ukrainians were using for production of some military things, and as I understand, starting of the 2nd of January this military plant is no longer exist. And according to information we have, and some Russian sources more or less reliable managed to collect the data, collect as much as possible information, and they provided us the numbers of the strikes. And furthermore, before we start with the numbers, when talking about the, for example, Russian military expert Ribber, he confirms that the main target of the Russians was the military objects, military infrastructure, and the most important industrial potential of military forces. So we have the numbers, and according to information we have, the Russians, when talking about Kiev area and Kiev region, managed to destroy one Patriot air defense system. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed one warehouse with attack missiles, one headquarters of Ukraine forces, and as a result of that strike against the headquarters, the Ukrainians lost 9 generals, including one deputy of Zaluzhny. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed 2 command centers and hotels with volunteers from Denmark, Lithuania, Estonia, and Sweden. More than 78 volunteers were lost during that attack. Furthermore, the Russians managed to discover and destroy the warehouse with more than 1,000 missiles for IRST and some systems, air defense systems. The numbers are very big. And sometimes I have a feeling that maybe this is not real information, because we will never receive geolocated confirmations. Maybe in time we're going to receive some updates and so on. But for example, today the Ukrainians reported that the Western countries are planning to send emergently Ukrainians 1,000 missiles for Patriot systems. So maybe update about destroyed warehouse with 1,000 missiles for IRST and SAMs is true, because now the Ukrainians don't have air defense system and missiles at all, and they need them to get as fast as possible. When talking about Odessa, according to the Russians, few hangars with Navy drones were destroyed. A significant number of headquarters were destroyed with the British and United Kingdom and Polish officers. Furthermore, according to the Russians, few radars were destroyed of French production. In Kharkiv, the Russians destroyed 1 IRST, 2 IRST systems, and 4 Gepard air defense systems. Also, few command centers and 65 officers. So according to all these updates, the Russians managed to achieve significant results as a result of strikes during the previous 4 days, on the 30th, 31st, 1st, and the 2nd of January. That's it about the missile strikes. Now we will move to also more important updates, and today we got another video of another act of democracy in Ukraine. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians kidnapped a person on the street who probably was going to his parents or to his wife. He was kidnapped and put inside of the bus, and then the bus left in an unknown direction. That this is very weird, because the Ukrainians have almost adopted the mobilization law, and this video was published, by the way, by the Ukrainian sources, deeply pro-Ukrainian sources on the territory of Ukraine, with the note, we are expecting official explanation from official sources. Obviously they're not going to receive any official notes, and that's it. Interesting update is coming from the western part of Ukraine. While one part of Ukraine is trying to survive or to hide, and of course it's impossible, they will be kidnapped on the strip. Other part of Ukraine try to cross the border and to escape Ukraine with attempt to cross the border. But Today, the Ukrainian sources published another video how they managed to discover another group of Ukrainian future soldiers. They were captured on the border, and obviously very soon they will be sent to Avdiivka or something like this. When talking about the global scope about Ukraine-Russian special military operation, probably the most important update is that today there was a prisoner exchange process, and as a result of that process, the Russians managed to return back more than 248 soldiers 248 prisoners of war that were in the territory of Ukraine. So for them, the hell has ended. And the Ukrainians reported that day, the Ukrainians managed to return up to 200 soldiers. As you can see, they're very happy with Ukrainian flags. So this is something like Orthodox exchange before the Russian, Ukrainian, former Ukrainian Orthodox Christmas. Furthermore, today we got update that Putin is planning to give a speech before the next few days, and obviously he's going to talk, according to my understanding of the situation, about the upcoming Orthodox ceasefire. Now we are moving to the south, and we have a lot of very interesting update from the Black Sea. And today, the Russian military expert Rybur published his own analysis about the situation that took place in this area. While the world was focused on missile strikes all over the entire Ukraine, the Ukrainians from the 2nd to the 3rd of January, during the previous night, launched a very powerful attack against the Russian forces in Crimea and in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians used combined attack. They were using missiles from the ground, and also the Ukrainians were trying to use Su-24 for those purposes, but the Russians reported they managed to discover and to shut down the Ukrainian Su-24. But this is not the most important about Su-24. The most important is about missiles. The Russians reported that they managed to shut down every single missile. Some of them just basically fell down in the sea. But there were two missiles, according to Rybur, that managed to bypass Crimea from the south. If you take a look at this map, you're going to see this bottom arrow, this one. They managed to bypass Crimea, and after that, the signal disappeared. And this is very interesting, as I understand, that was not like an attempt to... And according to destination of the flight, the Ukrainians were planning to get Novorossiysk. This is the area Novorossiysk. This is the second Russian military port after Crimean bases. As we know, during the previous period of time, the Russians were forced to redeploy their fleet closer to the Russian mainland due to the risk of being attacked by the Ukrainian missiles. And just recently, the Ukrainians destroyed another Russian ship. Now, the entire Russian fleet is concentrated along the cities like Novorossiysk and Sochi. Everything the Russians left in this area currently is located on this direction. And the Ukrainians tried to attack, and so based on Rybur report, the Ukrainians launched two missiles, and those two missiles bypassed significant distance, something like this, and they bypassed Crimea from the south, and they fell down somewhere in this area. And if we calculate the distance, we can see that the distance of Ukraine attack was around 500 kilometers. And obviously the Ukrainians were planning, maybe not planning, they were testing whether they are able to bypass Crimea. And they, when talking about the global scope of the operation, the Ukrainians were trying to find out whether they are able to bypass Crimea and to get Novorossiysk. And the distance to Novorossiysk from Odessa is around 700 kilometers. And this is a very big distance. And now we understand that the Russians are trying to stick their fleet as close to as possible to the mainland, to the Russian mainland. And now the Ukrainians try to find the solution how to attack these ships with new missiles they have, probably of Western production. Maybe they managed to create their own missiles. And this is also was the reason why the Russians were bombing Odessa and Ukraine, and mainly military production objects, because the Russians were hunting these, let's say, new technologies productions, and to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities in this type of weapon. So very interesting information, and we're gonna follow these updates as well. Now we are moving to the situation on the ground, and we're gonna start with Kherson direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published significant number of videos, geolocated videos of Lancet strikes. And now we see that the Russians are not using aviation, they are not bombing this territory with FAB, but according to the latest update I have just before starting making this video, there was one video published from Berislav of FABs. Maybe tomorrow in the morning, in the next update, we are going to discuss them. But now the Russians are trying to fight with Ukrainian air defense with Ukrainian artillery systems just with Lancet, and they're pretty effective. The Ukrainians lost during the previous days significant number of artillery systems, and of course this is a very big benefit and progress for the Russians when talking about foothold in Krynki. According to latest article I haven't finished analysis of that article. We'll discuss this article as well in the next video. The Ukrainians stopped any activity in Krynki, and according to information we have, there are no more Ukrainians who want to cross the river and to fight for this foothold. So maybe the Russians managed to break the entire situation, because from the other side we see that during the previous day, for the previous few days, we haven't received even a single geolocated video of any Russian attempt to storm this area, because most of attacks that the Russians tried to implement in the end of December were repelled by the Ukrainians, and having significant losses, the Russians were forced to step back to the, let's say, first positions, or like basic positions. But we'll see. Anyway, the situation in Krynki is still stable, but maybe within the next few days the situation will be changed in this area completely. Now we are moving to Zaporozhye area, and we got not just from Zaporozhye but from global perspective. The next day, the weather in Ukraine is going to get very, very bad. The temperature all over the Ukraine is going to fall down below the very deep below the zero, and the temperature is going to be around 18-20 Celsius below zero. So the situation is going to be very cold, and this is usually in this period of time during the Orthodox period of Russian, or let's say Orthodox Christmas period of time. And as I reminded that exactly a year ago, Putin announced during this period of time the Orthodox Christmas ceasefire, and after that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in Solidar, and after that, in a few months after, the Ukrainians lost Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. So maybe the Russians are planning to do something like this, because they have a lot of things and they have a lot of very big and huge progress on the same area in Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction. So now let's move to this area, because we have a lot of updates and a lot of geolocations from this territory. We have already started discussing this battle, the previous update, but during the day we got more updates. And the most important one is that, according to the previous video, with the Ukrainians, the Russians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians in the area between Chasov Yar, Ivanovska, and Khromovo. There was artillery preparation. The Russians managed to establish complete control over the main supply road that goes from Chasov Yar to the Ukrainian strongholds. And after that, the Russians bombed the fortifications. And after they managed to pin down the Ukrainians and suppress their forces, the Russians landed their infantry, stormtroopers, and captured the stronghold right in front of the cemetery. So according to my previous version, that was Ukrainian forces, but later we got more details from the ground, and that was the video published by the Russians of Russian infantry. So we have 100% confirmation of Russian control over this territory. But this is just like clarification regarding the previous video. The most important update is that the Russians, according to a lot of mappers, managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt along the railways and to establish control over these three lines along this area. So basically, according to this, the Russians managed to split the let's say this defense belt into two parts. It used to be like one defense belt from Bogdanovka to the cemetery and Popovo forest, and now this area was cut in two parts, and the Russians entered this area. And this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians, because now we also have updates about the Russian progress along this tree line, geolocated, confirmed. We have updates about the beginning of Russian storm of the cemetery. We have FPV drone strikes. We have the video of bombings of this entrance to this stronghold. So everything tells us that the Russians are planning to capture this defense belt by attacking from two directions, from the northern part using this line, and from the southern part from the cemetery. And if the Russians are able to establish control over this territory, and as I understand they're planning to do this, then the Ukrainians from this time are no longer will be able to force the Russians to step back, because this line, this defense belt from Bogdanovka to the cemetery, is the most important one. This stronghold is located on the hill, and this stronghold is something like a gates for the Ukrainians, let's say, for further offensive or counter-offensive in direction of Khromovo, Ivanovska, Yagidne, and many other settlements and villages, not Ivanovska, but Berkhovka, Yagidna, Khromovo, Bakhmut on the northern direction. And the Russians currently are trying to storm this area. Furthermore, we got the videos of destroyed Ukrainian tanks that were sent by the Ukrainians from Chasov Yar as a reinforcement. The reinforcement was destroyed, significant losses, and the Russians are about to collapse the Ukrainian defense belt in this area and to force the Ukrainians to step back further to the west in direction of Chasov Yar itself. So the situation in this area is very complicated for the Ukrainians. When talking about Bogdanovka, as we discussed in the previous video, the Russians also managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt along the tree line and to get the edge positions in this area and to capture this territory completely. And now the Russians are located in the hill and have full control over the Ukrainians in this part of Bogdanovka. By the way, if you follow different mappers, you're going to see that most of the mappers have already colored this territory, at least when talking about stronghold on the northeastern part of Bogdanovka under Russian control. But since the beginning of battle for Bogdanovka, we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation that the Russians have control over this territory. As I understand, according to geolocations we have, currently, the Russians are trying to encircle this area because we have the bombardments of Russian positions to the south of this stronghold. On these scenes, we can see the Russian infantry moving along the building. So the Russians are trying to attack along this line, trying to attack from the south of the stronghold, from many directions, and from the north from the hill. So all these geolocations tell us that the Russians have almost cleared the northwestern eastern part of Bogdanovka, and soon this area will collapse and the Ukrainians will be forced to step back to the central part or even further in direction of Kalinovka. So the Russians have just a few days before Christmas ceasefire, and it's around 4 days till the end of this week, and after that, after small artillery ceasefire period, they're going to be very powerful artillery preparation, and I expect that by the end of January the Russians will try to get Kalinovka and the first block of Chasov Yar on the east of the city. Of course, this is a very important battle. The Russians took a decision after some problems in Avdiivka and Sinikovka to pay and to focus completely their attention in the area they have the most significant progress. And we are talking about Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, because the Russians are advancing to the south as well. According to some mappers, most of the mappers, very reliable one, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the railways that goes from Kurdyumovka to Andreevka. And according to them, this area is under complete Russian control. They managed to clear this territory and to force the Ukrainians to step back. Furthermore, according to other Russian sources and different mappers, the Russians also managed to establish control over the positions along the railways to the north of Andreevka. So this area, according to the Russians, this territory also is under complete their control, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. So we see that Ukrainians currently are withdrawing their positions from Andreevka, from the southern part of Klishchiivka, towards the next defense stronghold belt. There are few fortifications, stronghold, very big stronghold to the west of Klishchiivka, the stronghold along canal, and a few small trenches in the vicinity of this area. So the Ukrainians are planning to try to stop the Russians, or at least to slow down them on this line, if of course they're able to do this, because I'm not sure they're able to do this, because the Russians from the other side also start declaring operation of Klishchiivka, because the configuration of the front line allows them to do this. Lots of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian reconnaissance and sabotage groups, so everything develops not in Ukrainian favor. But the most important is the question, what is the next Russian plan? What the Russians are planning to do after they establish control over, let's say, Bogdanovka, Ivanovska, after the Russians reach the canal? What are they going to do next? Of course, we can draw some clouds showing the, let's say, current basic Russian, let's say, goal. And the first goal of the Russian forces is to reach canal, because this is from the first perspective is just the most, let's say, useful and say normal defense belt, because it's like natural defense belt, and it's going to be for the Russians very easy to protect this territory because of this like natural barrier. So this is the first Russian goal, to capture this territory or to return control or whatever. But the question is, what are the next Russian steps? Because from one side we see that the Russians, after securing this area, are able to continue offensive operation further to Canal and to try establish control over this city from the north, or maybe to attack the same city from the south. Very likely the Russians are able to do this and can do this. But as I understand, according to information we have, the Russians concentrated around 80,000 soldiers on Bakhmut direction. This is a very big and powerful army. Just imagine yourself, 80,000, 8 and 4 zeros after. Very powerful army, and the Russians are blocked in this area. They stuck. They are forced to use to save their presence in this direction due to very dangerous situation and danger that comes from Ukrainian side, from Chasiv Yar, Konstantinovka. But as soon as the Russians are able to get Canal, this line, then they will be able, first of all, to secure the flank, and they will be able to release their forces, and they will be able to use these 80,000 army somewhere else. And as I understand, the next Russian goals and the next Russian plan is going to be attack in direction of Mykolaiv along the same canal to the north in direction of Slaviansk, because today we got more updates from Veselaya. More and more sources reported about the Russian progress in this area, that the Russians are taking this village Veselaya in pincers, and that soon the Russians are going to start the ground storming operation. Furthermore, during the previous days we got a lot of updates from the area by the name of from Liman direction. We remember the clashes and Russian progress in Tarskoye salient, and when talking about the global scope, the Russians are moving from Kremenna to Terny, and obviously they're planning not just to establish control over the villages along this river. Obviously, the main purpose of the Russians to cross the Zhiribets river in this area to attack in direction of Kolodizy, and after Kolodizy to start movements further to the south in direction of Stavki and Liman. So as I understand, this is the next Russian plans, and obviously the Russians are planning or are trying to start implementation of this severe ground operation after the ceasefire and after the Orthodox Christmas. But before that, of course, they need to finish the situation with Chasiv Yar, with this foothold, and then they will be able to move further to the north. During the spring, they will build strongholds along Canal, and this is the things that I think the Russians are planning to implement during the next few months this year. When talking about Kupiansk direction, there are no changes. That's just the thing we have already discussed, that the Russians lost completely their foothold in Sinkovka. The Ukrainians managed to restore their positions, and currently the Russians are trying to regroup themselves to the south of Liman Pervy, trying to find a solution, trying to find new plan how to attack Sinkovka and how to force the Ukrainians to step back from this area, because even this Siversk operation is just a part of a bigger operation. I'm talking about Slaviansk-Kramatorsk offensive operation. By taking this foothold, the Russians will be able to half encircle Slaviansk just from the southern and northern and northeastern part. But to attack Slaviansk-Kramatorsk, of course, the Russians sooner or later will be forced to attack and return back to Izum, and to find a solution how to attack these cities from Izum direction. But for these purposes, they need to do something with Kupiansk. And for now, we see a complete absence of Russian progress on this direction due to Ukrainian strongholds and fortifications. When talking about Avdiivka, we haven't received anything in comparison with the previous update. The only thing we got is geolocated Russian bombardments of the southern part of Avdiivka. So we start receiving something from this area after a very long operational pause. Probably within the next few days, the Russians are planning to intensify their activity in actions with the purpose to complete the collapse of Ukrainian defense belt to the south of Avdiivka and to get as deep as possible inside of the central part of the city. Because according to information we have, the Russians do have some problems on the northern direction. The Ukrainians slowly, step by step, are returning their positions to the north of the chemical plant and to the southeast of Stepova. And this is like we see that the Russians currently are trying to get as deep as possible along the railways, and for a very long period of time the Russians haven't made any attempt to do anything with this direction. Now the main purpose is to hold this red line. They need to control this area, because if the Ukrainians can regroup and concentrate some attack first, the Ukrainians even have possibilities to return control over Terikon, which will collapse the Russian offensive operation that currently take place along this residential area. So now the Russians are trying to stay in defense, and the Ukrainians obviously within the next few days will try to make a lot of attempts to attack with the purpose of returning Terikon back. So the battle for Terikon is going to take place obviously, and we'll see what is going to be next. When talking about South Donetsk direction, we haven't received almost anything from this area, just a video of demining process, how the Russians continue demining the mine fields around Novomikhailivka. The Russians managed to enter the village from the south, from the farms, from the eastern part, but there are still so many mines, and the Russians currently stuck in this area. They wait for some progress of the Russian forces in direction of Marinka, Novomikhailivka, but all these mine fields is a very big problem for the Russians. On this video, for example, we can see the kamikaze machine that the Russians is like a practice and pattern of the Russian forces. As I understand, this is the best solution the Russians found, how to demine and clear the fields, and as a result of destroying another kamikaze machine, another part of the field was cleared and demined. When talking about Robotyne, we haven't received anything in comparison with the previous update. The Russians continue offensive operation and storming and bombing the Ukrainian positions in the area between Nesteryanka, Mirna, Novoandreevka to the west of Robotyne, of Verbova, and also the Russians attack and continue offensive operation against the Ukrainian forces in Robotyne itself, but without any changes on the ground. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.